September 19, 1863. Chickamauga, Georgia. The battle was raging at its worst. Smoke was so thick men could barely see their hands in front of their faces, the screaming of artillery, the crack of muskets, the cries of the wounded. A Union private named Jacob Miller charged forward with his regiment, then something hit him, not in the arm, not in the leg, in the forehead. A Confederate musket ball struck him square in the center of his forehead. He dropped. His comrades, glancing back as they ran, were certain he was dead. A man shot in the head on a Civil War battlefield did not survive. Everyone knew that, but Jacob Miller did not die. Covered in so much blood that Confederate soldiers did not recognize him as a Yankee, he staggered to his feet. He used his rifle as a walking stick. He stumbled through the Confederate lines, past Southern soldiers who stared at the blood-soaked figure and let him pass. He made it back to Union lines. He collapsed. The surgeons shook their heads. The bullet had lodged deep in his skull. They could not remove it. They told him he would not live to see the next morning. Jacob Miller lived for another 54 years. He lived with that bullet in his head. Piece by piece, over the following decades, fragments of lead slowly worked their way out of the wound on their own. When they did, he would fall into delirious stupors, sometimes for 2 weeks at a time, imagining he was back on picket duty. His neighbors would watch this blood-soaked, broken man pacing back and forth, a stick on his shoulder for a musket. And then he would recover and go on living. He died in 1917 at the age of 76 with a bullet wound in his forehead that had never fully closed, 54 years after a Confederate bullet should have killed him. This is the story of the soldiers who could not die. Introduction. Welcome, friends. I am so glad you are here with me today. The Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history. More Americans died in that war than in every other war the country has ever fought combined. The weapons were devastating, the medicine was primitive, the chances of survival were often terrifyingly slim. And yet, there are stories from the Civil War that seem impossible. Stories of men who were shot through the head and lived for decades. Men who were wounded time after time after time and kept fighting. Men who were declared dead, had their obituaries printed in newspapers, and then showed up alive. These are not legends. These are not myths. These are documented, verified historical facts. Today we are going to tell the stories of the Civil War's most incredible survivors. Men who faced wounds that should have killed them instantly and somehow kept living. Men who seemed to defy death so many times that their fellow soldiers started to wonder if they were human at all. These are the soldiers who could not die. If you love these stories of impossible survival and extraordinary human resilience, I hope you will subscribe to our channel. We are building a community here to keep these memories alive. Now, let us go back to the battlefields and to the men who refused to leave them. Background. To understand why these stories are so extraordinary, you need to understand what the Civil War battlefield was really like. The weapons of the Civil War were designed to kill, not wound, kill. The standard rifle fired a mini-A ball, a soft lead bullet about half an inch in diameter. When it hit a human body, it did not make a clean hole. It shattered bone, it tore through muscle. It tumbled and deformed on impact, creating a massive wound channel. A mini-A ball that hit an arm or leg almost always resulted in amputation. Not because surgeons wanted to amputate, but because the shattered bone and destroyed tissue could not be saved. The choice was amputation or gangrene, and gangrene meant a slow, agonizing death. A mini-A ball that hit the chest or abdomen was almost always fatal. There was nothing surgeons could do for a stomach wound. Men who were shot in the torso were laid aside, given morphine if it was available, and left to die. A mini-A ball that hit the head was, well, that was supposed to be instantly fatal, but here is the thing about the human body. It is extraordinarily resilient, it wants to survive, and sometimes in ways that defy medical understanding it does. The Civil War produced more documented cases of miraculous survival than perhaps any other conflict in history. Not because the war was somehow gentle, but because there were so many wounds, so many injuries. And among the millions of men who were shot, a small number survived things that simply should not have been survivable. These are their stories. The man with a bullet in his head. We began with Jacob Miller, but his story deserves to be told in full. Miller was a private in the 6th Indiana Infantry. He was an ordinary soldier, no special fame, no special rank, just a man from Indiana who enlisted because his country was at war. At Chickamauga on September 19, 1863, the Confederate Army launched one of the most devastating attacks of the war. The Union line shattered, men ran, regiments were destroyed in minutes. In the chaos, Jacob Miller was shot. The bullet entered his forehead and lodged in his skull, By every medical understanding of the time, and frankly by modern medical understanding as well, a wound like this should have been immediately fatal. The brain is extraordinarily vulnerable. Pressure from a bullet in the skull causes swelling, bleeding, and rapid death, but Miller did not die. He staggered through the battlefield, barely conscious. Confederate soldiers saw him but assumed he was one of their own wounded. No Union soldier could possibly be walking around with a head wound like that. They let him pass. He made it to a stretcher. He made it to a hospital tent. A nurse wrapped his head in a wet bandage. And then the surgeons came. They examined the wound. They probed for the bullet. They could not find it or could not safely remove it. The bullet was lodged in his skull, apparently resting against or near the brain itself. They told him he would be dead by morning, but morning came and Jacob Miller was still alive, and the next morning, and the next. Over the following weeks he slowly recovered. He was discharged from the army. He went home to Indiana. He tried to live a normal life, but normal was not something Jacob Miller could ever have again. The bullet in his head caused periodic crises. He would suddenly fall into a stupor. His eyes would glaze over. He would become delirious, sometimes for days at a time, sometimes for 2 weeks. During these episodes, he would imagine he was back at Chickamauga. He would pace back and forth outside his house, a stick on his shoulder like a rifle, going through the motions of being a soldier. His neighbors watched this haunted, wounded man and felt a mixture of pity and awe. Over the years, something strange happened. The bullet began to move. Fragments of lead, breaking off from the original bullet, slowly worked their way through his skull toward the surface of the wound. The wound on his forehead never fully closed, and occasionally a piece of lead would emerge from it. Each time this happened, Miller would experience a crisis, the delirium, the stupors. Then, as the pressure decreased, gradual recovery. By the time Miller spoke to a reporter in 1911, he was 78 years old. The reporter described him as one of the most remarkable hero survivors of the Civil War. The wound in his forehead was still visible, still open after 48 years. Jacob Miller died in 1917, 54 years after a Confederate bullet lodged in his brain. The doctors who examined him in his final years shook their heads in disbelief. By all medical logic, he should have died in 1863. That he lived into the 20th century, with a bullet wound in his head that never healed, remains one of the most extraordinary medical mysteries in Civil War history. The enemy who wouldn't stay dead. The Civil War was full of stories where enemies became connected by the strangest of circumstances, but none stranger than the story of Peter Knapp and Newton Meadows. Peter Knapp was a rifleman with the 5th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. In 1863, he was stationed at Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Union and Confederate forces were locked in a brutal siege. Confederate sharpshooters were a constant threat. They hid in trees, in fortifications, in ruined buildings, picking off Union soldiers one by one. Every Union soldier who exposed himself was a potential target. One day Knapp spotted a Confederate sniper. The man was positioned in a tree looking down his rifle barrel at Union positions. Knapp took careful aim. He fired. He saw the sniper fall. He was certain of his shot, a hit to the head. Nobody survived a shot to the head. Knapp moved on. He continued fighting. He was eventually captured and spent time in Confederate prison camps. The war ended. He went home to Michigan. He moved to Washington State. He got married. He got old. He tried to forget the war. 58 years passed. Then in 1921, Peter Knapp was reading a newspaper and he stopped cold. The article described a man who had been eating dinner when he suddenly appeared to be choking. His family panicked. But instead of choking on food, the man coughed up something extraordinary. A 1-ounce bullet, solid lead, 58 years old. The man's name was Newton Meadows. He was a Confederate veteran from Vicksburg, and according to the article, he had been shot in the right eye during the siege. The bullet had lodged in his skull and had never been removed. For 58 years it had been sitting there, and now somehow it had worked its way loose and he had coughed it up. Knapp read the description, the location. The date, the wound, he knew immediately. He had been the one who fired that shot. 58 years ago, he had shot Newton Meadows in the eye at Vicksburg. He had assumed Meadows was dead, and Meadows had lived for 58 years with his bullet in his head. Knapp sat down and wrote Meadows a letter. He introduced himself. He explained that he believed he was the man who had shot him. He asked if Meadows remembered anything about the incident. Meadows wrote back. They corresponded. Two old men, a Union soldier and a Confederate soldier, connected across decades by a bullet and a miracle of survival. They never met in person. But they wrote to each other until the end of their lives, bound together by a moment of violence that should have ended one of them, and instead became one of the strangest friendships of the post-war era. The man the war killed twice on paper. One of the strangest phenomena of the Civil War was the number of soldiers who were officially declared dead and then turned up alive. The chaos of Civil War battles made accurate record-keeping nearly impossible. When a regiment took heavy casualties, officers often could not find all their men. Some were wounded and left on the field, some were captured, some were simply separated from their units in the smoke and confusion. When these men could not be found after a battle, they were often listed as killed in action. Their names were read out in reports, their families received notifications, their obituaries were printed in local newspapers, and sometimes weeks or even months later they simply walked home. Imagine the scene, a family who has spent weeks mourning their father, their son, their husband. A funeral perhaps even without a body to bury, the town coming together to mourn, and then a knock on the door, and the dead man standing there, thinner, scarred, but alive. This happened dozens of times throughout the war. Men who had been captured and imprisoned. Men who had been wounded and taken to faraway hospitals where their names were recorded incorrectly. Men who had been unconscious for weeks and had no idea their families thought they were dead. Confederate General Gabriel Rains experienced this himself. During the Seminole Wars, years before the Civil War, Rains was shot through the body in a battle with Seminole warriors in Florida. The wound was so severe, so clearly mortal in the opinion of those who saw it, that newspapers in North Carolina actually published his obituary. He recovered. He showed up very much alive. He went on to serve in the Mexican War and then in the Civil War as a Confederate general. He invented landmines, sank Union ships with naval torpedoes, and lived until 1881. The man who had been declared dead in Florida went on to change the nature of warfare forever. The most wounded man in the Union Army. If there was one man who embodied the title of the soldier who could not die, it was a Union officer named George Armstrong. Actually, the records of the Civil War are full of men who were wounded multiple times and kept returning to duty. The medical records of the Union Army alone contain thousands of cases of soldiers who were wounded 2, 3, 4, 5 times in different battles and kept surviving. But there are a handful of cases that stand above all others. Consider the documented cases of soldiers who were shot at close range and survived because the bullet was deflected by a pocket watch, a Bible, or a metal button. These stories sound like legend, but they are documented in military records and family histories. A soldier at Gettysburg named William was shot in the chest. The bullet should have gone through his heart. Instead, it hit the metal case of a pocket watch he carried. The watch was destroyed. The bullet was deflected. The man lived. Another soldier at Antietam carried a small Bible in his breast pocket. A bullet hit the Bible. It penetrated through the New Testament and stopped somewhere in the Old. The soldier was bruised and shaken but unharmed. He kept that Bible for the rest of his life. Visitors to museums can still see Civil War Bibles with bullet holes that stop just short of the back cover. These are not miracles in the supernatural sense. They are the random mathematics of warfare. When millions of bullets are fired, some of them will hit things that deflect them. Some of them will miss vital organs by fractions of an inch. But to the men they saved, they felt like miracles. And who are we to say they were not? Then there were men who were simply, inexplicably, impossible to kill on the battlefield. One such man was Sergeant James Durham of the 24th Michigan Infantry. Durham fought at Gettysburg with the Iron Brigade, one of the toughest Union fighting units. The Iron Brigade famously held the line on the first day of Gettysburg, buying time for the rest of the Union Army to arrive. They suffered catastrophic casualties. Durham's regiment went into the first day's fighting at Gettysburg with nearly 500 men. By the end of the day, fewer than 100 were still standing. The regiment had been almost completely destroyed. Durham survived. He survived the Wilderness. He survived Spotsylvania. He survived Cold Harbor. He survived Petersburg. At Cold Harbor in June of 1864, the Union Army launched a frontal assault on heavily fortified Confederate positions. In less than an hour, the Union Army lost 7,000 men. It was one of the most catastrophic attacks of the war. Durham survived. By the end of the war, he had been in the thick of the fighting from Gettysburg to Appomattox. He had been wounded multiple times. He had survived battles that destroyed regiment after regiment. He lived until 1912. His fellow soldiers, both those who served with him and those who met him after the war, used to say simply, "That man cannot be killed." The doctors who made the impossible possible. Part of the reason so many Civil War soldiers survived wounds that should have been fatal was the doctors. Not the popular image of Civil War doctors as brutal butchers with blood-soaked saws, but the real Civil War surgeons who were actually pioneers of modern medicine. Civil War surgeons performed over 60,000 amputations during the war, and the survival rate was for the era remarkable. Nearly 3 out of 4 men who had limbs amputated survived the surgery and recovered. These surgeons developed new techniques under pressure. They learned from experience at a speed that peacetime medicine could never have achieved. They developed triage, the practice of sorting wounded men by severity and treating those who could be saved first. They improved anesthesia. They developed new surgical approaches to removing bullets and shell fragments. They could not fight infection. Antibiotics would not exist for another 80 years. But they learned to recognize infection early. They learned that certain practices led to higher survival rates, even if they did not understand the germ theory of disease. The Civil War was, in a terrible way, a crash course in battlefield medicine that saved the lives of thousands of men who would otherwise have died, including men like Jacob Miller, whose wound would have killed virtually anyone treated even 50 years earlier. The last man standing. Perhaps the most extraordinary survival story of the Civil War is not a story of individual wounds at all. It is the story of James Hard. James Hard was born in 1843 in Rochester, New York. He enlisted in the Union Army at the age of 18. He fought in some of the most brutal battles of the war. He survived. After the war, he went home. He lived quietly. He watched the decades pass. Other veterans aged and died. The Grand Army of the Republic, the great Union Veterans Organization, held its annual encampments. Each year there were fewer men. The men who had fought at Bull Run were gone. The men who had fought at Antietam were gone. The men who had fought at Gettysburg were gone. James Hard kept living. He lived through World War I. He lived through the Great Depression. He lived through World War II. He lived to see jet airplanes and nuclear bombs and the beginning of the Cold War. He died in 1953 at the age of 109. He was the last surviving Union combat veteran of the Civil War. Think about that. James Hard was born before the railroad reached much of America. He fought in a war where men used muzzle-loading rifles. He lived long enough to see the hydrogen bomb, the last man standing from the Army of the Potomac, the last living connection to the battles of the Civil War, the last soldier who had stood on those fields and faced that fire. He had outlived them all, every general, every colonel, every private who had served alongside him. The soldier who could not die had finally, at the age of 109, decided he was ready. Reflection. Friends, why do we tell these stories? Not because we want to romanticize war. War is not romantic. The Civil War produced hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of wounds. Every man who survived impossibly also left behind 10 men who did not. We tell these stories because they reveal something profound about the human spirit. Jacob Miller, with a bullet in his head for 54 years, did not give up. He lived as fully as he could. He carried his war with him literally until the day he died. Peter Knapp and Newton Meadows, enemies on a battlefield, found connection and even friendship in their shared impossible experience. Two men bound together by a moment of violence who chose to transform it into something human. The soldiers who were declared dead and came home alive. They understood something about survival that the rest of us can only imagine. They had been on the other side. They had stood at the very edge of death and stepped back. And James Hard, the last man standing, who lived through every era of American history from the Civil War to the Cold War. He was a living bridge between the world that was and the world that came after. What do these stories teach us? That the human body is more resilient than we imagine. That the human will to survive is more powerful than any bullet. And that sometimes, against all logic, against all probability, people live. As we close today, I want you to picture Jacob Miller one more time. Not the young soldier falling on the battlefield at Chickamauga, not the blood-soaked figure staggering through Confederate lines, but the old man, the 78-year-old man with the never-healing wound on his forehead, sitting in his home in the early 1900s, being interviewed by a reporter who can barely believe what he is hearing. A man who has carried a Civil War battlefield inside his own skull for nearly half a century. A man who fought death over and over in the delirium of his episodes, in the slow working out of lead fragments from his wound, in the sheer stubborn persistence of his heartbeat. He did not survive because he was special. He did not survive because God loved him more than the men who died beside him. He survived because the human body is extraordinary, because life, when it wants to hold on, can hold on against almost anything. The Civil War killed more Americans than any other conflict in our history, but it also produced some of the most remarkable stories of survival ever recorded. Stories that remind us, even in the darkest times, that people can endure, that the human spirit is harder to extinguish than any bullet, that sometimes the soldier who should have died simply does not. Friends, if this story moved you, please share it. These stories of impossible survival deserve to be remembered. And tell me in the comments, which of these stories surprised you most? Had you heard of Jacob Miller before? I read every comment and I learned so much from you. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, keep their memory alive.